In 1944, the Americans intercepted a strange recording. There were no voices, only explosions, the sound of steel shattering, and the final breaths of an empire sinking to the bottom of the sea. That June, in the middle of the Atlantic summer, the sky was dark and velvet-like, the ocean surface eerily calm. Thousands of meters above, U.S. Navy TBF Avenger aircraft circled like phantoms, searching for something beneath the black waters. They didn't rely on human eyes, but on technology their enemies had never known. Below the waves, a massive Japanese vessel moved silently, the transport submarine I-52, the pride of Imperial Japan's naval engineering. In the cramped command compartment, Lieutenant Commander Uno Kameo peered through the periscope. Not far away, Nazi Germany's U-530 had just departed after delivering radar equipment, 2 engineers, and crates of top-secret technology. The mission was complete. Ahead lay a long journey to Bordeaux in German-occupied France. The submarine carried 2 tons of gold, 120 tons of tin, and strategic cargo, a desperate gift to their ally across the ocean. The sea was calm, radar silent, the sky empty. Everything seemed perfect. But in that darkness, an era was about to end, and just 3 hours later, the I-52, along with all 96 souls on board, would vanish, marking a silent revolution of American science beneath the waves. 11:40 p.m., June 23, 1944. Aboard an escort plane from USS Bogue, Lieutenant Jesse D. Taylor watched the radar screen intently. A faint dot appeared, then grew clearer. A surface submarine, heading northwest at 15 knots. Taylor clenched his jaw. "We've got it." He descended and dropped flares. The sea lit up momentarily, revealing a vessel over 100 meters long, the I-52. The submarine dove immediately. Taylor dove too, dropping the first depth charges. Water erupted white, the surface trembled, but the target vanished. Below, Uno Kameo calmly ordered, "Descend to 150 meters. Shut down all auxiliary engines. Maintain silence." The hull grew thick with tension. Only heartbeats and the whisper of water brushing against the steel could be heard. No one knew that what had just been dropped wasn't a bomb, but an underwater listening device. The Sonar Buoy. Small and compact, the Sonar Buoy was a new invention by American and British engineers. Dropped from aircraft, it floated on the surface, lowered a microphone into the sea, and transmitted sounds of submarine engines back to the plane via radio waves. It was the ocean's ears, and Japan never knew the ocean could hear. Just seconds after the buoy hit the water, a steady metallic sound came through Taylor's headset, the turning of a propeller. The I-52 was still submerged, but it was no longer invisible. Taylor tracked the sound, adjusted course, and released his final weapon, the Mark 24 Fido acoustic homing torpedo. No aiming needed, no remote control. Fido only needed to listen. It homed in on sound, found its target, and attacked. Beneath the waves, Japanese sailors heard a distant whine, drawing closer, faster. Then an explosion. Silence followed. Then the sound of steel being crushed like a tin can. That sound was recorded on 2 copper reels labeled Gordon Wire Number 1 and Number 2. These small reels, still preserved in the U.S. National Archives today, captured the moment a ship and an entire pride sank to the ocean floor. The I-52 broke in 2, disappearing at a depth of 17,000 feet, over 5,200 meters. Along with it were 96 lives, 2 German engineers, and 2 tons of gold. None of them knew what had happened. None realized they were the first victims of an invisible weapon, a fusion of radar, Sonar Buoy, and acoustic torpedoes. From that night on, undersea warfare was no longer a duel between men. It became a battle between intellect and technology. In the sky, Taylor gave a brief radio report. Target destroyed, depth unknown, recording complete. Then he flew away. The ocean surface fell still again. Only a small buoy drifted, its green light blinking on the dark waves. And somewhere deep beneath the water, metallic echoes still rang out. A sound heralding a new era of technological warfare had begun. From that night on, the ocean was no longer theirs.
Before the wreckage of the I-52 even reached the ocean floor, on the other side of the Atlantic, in America's shipyards and laboratories, a quiet revolution had already been completed. It wasn't just the victory of a single battle, but the birth of an industry that could listen to the sea. As early as 1943, the Americans understood that to control the oceans, they needed to hear underwater and see in the dark. Their enemies, Germany and Japan, possessed advanced submarines capable of hiding for weeks, striking, and vanishing like ghosts. But the U.S. didn't try to build bigger ships. They built the technology to make those ghosts visible. In the noisy metal workshops of Connecticut, California, and New Hampshire, thousands of engineers and workers labored around the clock. On the walls of Electric Boat's factory, a bright red slogan read, "Every rivet is a bullet against fascism." From Bell Laboratories and the Harvard Underwater Sound Lab to MIT, countless top-secret projects were underway. Active sonar, passive sonar, Sonar Buoys, target-finding radar, automatic fire control computers, acoustic torpedoes. Every small device was refined, improved, and mass-produced. By mid-1944, while Japan was just beginning to install primitive radar on some of its submarines, the U.S. Navy had already deployed a global sensor network, from escort carriers, Avenger aircraft, destroyers, to hunter-killer submarines. Each unit was a cog in a vast machine. The USS Bogue, an escort carrier launched in 1942, became a symbol of that power. On its deck, Avengers continuously launched and landed, carrying radar, sonar, and Fido torpedoes. In just 2 years, Bogue's task force destroyed 13 German and Japanese submarines, a number that sent shockwaves through Japan's entire undersea fleet. This was no longer ship versus ship warfare. It was data warfare, signal warfare. Every sonar ping, every radio frequency, every underwater sound became a command, life or death. American engineers called it the Silent Revolution, a revolution without gunfire, without flashes, only sound. Something humanity had never fully weaponized before. Sonar Buoys, once just an experimental idea, became the fleet's eyes and ears. Deployed in V-shapes or circles, the small buoys formed underwater listening nets across the sea's surface. From above, aircraft could detect submarine engines kilometers away and guide torpedoes to their targets. Technology and tactics became one, for the first time in history. In the U.S. Navy's year-end reports for 1944, dry lines of text revealed a stunning reality. Enemy submarine detection rate tripled, destruction rate doubled compared to the previous year. But beyond those numbers was something bigger, a total shift in the philosophy of war. Where others believed strength came from firepower and steel, America proved that true power came from the union of science, industry, and organization. As war escalated, factories on both coasts became cathedrals of modern industry. Over 500,000 engineers, workers, and scientists, most who had never been to sea, were now determining the outcome of deep ocean battles. Each sonar, each radar, each tiny component was standardized, tested, and produced at unprecedented speed. While Japan struggled to keep 70 submarines operational due to fuel and parts shortages, the U.S. built over 200 new subs in just 4 years, each completed in months and equipped with the latest technology. There was no miracle ship from America, only a miracle system running flawlessly. American commanders understood that modern warfare wasn't just about hitting the enemy, it was about finding them first. And to do that, you had to hear better, see farther, process faster. In 1944, the U.S. Navy began deploying mobile sound analysis centers, where young technicians, their hands still greasy with engine oil, listened for hours to sonar tapes. They learned to distinguish every sound: whale calls, wave noise, merchant ships, Japanese submarines. They called it learning the language of the ocean. To surviving Japanese crews, it became a new kind of wartime terror. No one knew how they had been detected. They dove deep, maintained absolute silence, yet American aircraft still dropped bombs with uncanny precision. They didn't understand, and had no defense. In Japanese officers' logs, a chilling phrase was repeated: "The Americans can hear heartbeats underwater." Throughout 1944, American anti-submarine technology became an invisible weapon of destruction. Japanese submarines were hunted down, supply lines severed, and for the U.S., each victory became a leap forward in science. Each campaign, a giant laboratory of live experimentation. The cold numbers ultimately shaped history. 1,342 Japanese ships sunk, 5.3 million tons of cargo lost to the sea, over half the empire's merchant fleet destroyed by American submarines alone. These were more than statistics. They were proof of a new era, an age where technology and organization could defeat even the seemingly invincible. On the deck of the USS Bogue, Lieutenant Jesse Taylor, the man who sank the I-52, wrote a single chilling line in his journal. "No one heard their screams. Only the machines did, and they never forget." Those words, cold and hauntingly real, captured the essence of the new war. A war of science, where silence was the sound of power. While the Americans saw the ocean as something to conquer, the Japanese viewed it as their natural domain. One side looked at the sea with the eyes of an engineer, the other with the heart of a warrior. When World War II broke out, the Imperial Japanese Navy's submarine force was considered one of the most formidable in the world. Their vessels, the I-class, massive, sophisticated, with exceptional range, were built to accompany attack fleets, serve reconnaissance missions, and provide support. The Japanese called them the eyes beneath the sea of the Imperial Navy. In the early days of the war, that strategy seemed sound. Japanese submarines had appeared at Pearl Harbor, scouted the California coast, and made the U.S. Navy wary. But Japan's perception of a submarine's role became its own undoing. The Americans, in contrast, saw submarines as tools to sever the enemy's lifelines. As early as late 1941, the U.S. Navy issued an order: attack any ship flying the Japanese flag, military or merchant. It was total war beneath the sea. A ruthless strategy, but one so effective it defied imagination. While Japanese subs hunted for warships, American submarines quietly sank ships carrying fuel, food, and strategic materials. While Japan was chasing big prey, America was strangling the enemy's economy. By 1944, over 90% of Japan's shipping routes had been cut. Tankers from the Dutch East Indies, rice transports from Burma, ore shipments from Indochina, all were sent to the bottom. Japanese admirals understood that without oil, the war could not continue. But they never imagined that their destroyer would not be a fleet, but shadows at the ocean floor. Strategic misjudgment was only part of the problem. The deeper and more painful issue was the technology gap. Japanese submarines were crafted like works of art, large, complex, feature-packed. They even built aircraft-carrying submarines, the I-400 class, nearly 120 meters long, capable of launching 3 attack seaplanes. But that very complexity made them slow, noisy, and easy to detect. Their massive engines echoed for miles. Their sonar signatures were obvious: perfect prey for America's increasingly refined anti-submarine systems. Meanwhile, American subs, smaller, simpler, were standardized down to the last bolt. Each one was equipped with radar, sonar, ballistic computers, and the most advanced data systems of the time. They didn't operate by instinct, but by math, electronics, and statistics. A Japanese commander would later admit during his Tokyo testimony, "We believed courage and discipline could compensate for all shortcomings, but then we realized courage can't hear underwater." It was a bitter truth. While American engineers welded every steel plate and fine-tuned every sonar device, Japanese engineers struggled to find raw materials, shared a single battery unit between two subs, and always trailed behind. Even by mid-1944, most Japanese submarines lacked fully functioning radar, while American subs could detect targets 20-30 miles away, even in total darkness. Beyond technology, organization and intelligence became weapons, too. Thanks to their breaking of Japanese codes, Magic and Ultra, the Americans knew the locations, schedules, and missions of many enemy subs. In other words, they struck before the Japanese even showed up. The ocean was vast, but to the Americans, every Japanese ship already had coordinates. For the Japanese, hearing of such victories, there was only one desperate conclusion: the ocean has betrayed us. Throughout 1944, reports from Japanese commanders were filled with helpless descriptions, subs detected even at depth, bombs dropped with pinpoint accuracy, torpedoes that followed for miles, phenomena they could not explain. What they didn't know was that behind each attack was a lab, an analysis center, hundreds of engineers and mathematicians working from thousands of miles away. The battlefield was no longer a place for individuals. It had become a place for systems. By early 1945, less than 1/3 of Japan's submarine fleet remained. Many were destroyed without ever sending a final signal. Survivors began to realize they were no longer fighting the U.S. Navy. They were fighting American science. After the war, Lieutenant Commander Nambu, captain of the I-401, recalled during interrogation, "I knew Japan had lost, not when Hiroshima was destroyed, but when I listened to the Americans' radio chatter. They spoke calmly. They had everything. We had nothing but silence." These were two mindsets, two paths, two destinies. The Americans believed science would win. The Japanese believed the warrior spirit could overturn all odds. But in the deep sea of 1945, when radar and sonar had replaced swords and guns, only one truth remained. The ocean belonged to those who understood technology. From the silence of their steel chambers, the last Japanese sailors knew they were living through the turning point of history. And as the surface of the sea closed over the 130th sunken ship, it also closed over a centuries-old pride. The ocean was no longer an ally. It had become a mirror, reflecting clearly who had entered the new era and who was still trapped in an old dream. Summer 1945. On the war map at the Japanese Naval General Staff Headquarters in Tokyo, the waters surrounding the home islands were boldly shaded blue, marked as the absolute safe zone. They believed that the dense minefields in the Tsushima Strait and the Sea of Japan formed an impenetrable steel wall. "There," a Japanese officer said, "American submarines will never get through. The ocean is still ours." But they were wrong. On the foggy night of June 4, 1945, 3 U.S. submarines, USS Sea Dog, USS Creval, and USS Spadefish, approached the Tsushima Strait. On deck, the crew sat silently, listening to the steady ping from a new device, FM sonar, also known as Hell's Bells. With every ping, the echoes returned as images on a display, a sound map of the entire minefield. They no longer traveled in darkness. They were seeing with sound. For 20 continuous hours, the The three subs threaded their way through narrow gaps between hundreds of naval mines, some just 50 meters apart. When they surfaced, the entire fleet was intact, and they had entered the Sea of Japan, a place the Japanese believed to be untouchable. 2 days later, 6 more submarines followed, forming a mission codenamed Operation Barney. 9 American subs, armed with advanced sonar and modern weaponry, began prowling the waters the Japanese had once called their naval sanctuary. From June 9th to 24th, 1945, just 16 days, they sank 28 Japanese vessels, including destroyers and submarines. Not a single American sub was lost. The victory was so swift that Japanese naval reports at the time were suspected of being errors. But there were no errors, only the collapse of the last illusion. Japanese officers at the port of Sasebo received the first reports in stunned disbelief. Enemy submarines operating in the Sea of Japan, inside our minefields. No one could believe it. For 4 years, they had considered those waters their only safe zone, where convoys and warships could travel without fear of ambush. But now, even their homes had become hunting grounds. An internal report read, "The Americans are everywhere. They know every one of our routes, and it's as if the ocean itself tells them where we are." For the American sailors, Operation Barney wasn't just a military mission. It was a technological declaration. As the sonar pings rang out, "Hell's bells, hell's bells," they knew they were walking through death, and they kept going. They believed in math, in engineering, in the human hands that built their machines. They were not led by luck, but by science. Across the ocean, at the Kure Naval Base, Admiral Tatsunosuke Ariazumi, the father of Japan's submarine program, gazed solemnly at a map. Red pins marking lost submarines were growing by the day. He understood that a lifetime of effort, giant vessels, thick steel hulls, brave sailors, was being defeated by tiny devices Japan had never been able to produce. Ariazumi whispered to a young officer, "We didn't lose because we lacked courage. We lost because we couldn't hear what they could hear." A month later, when Japan surrendered, he chose suicide aboard the I-401 rather than witness his submarines surrender. Meanwhile, the American submariners returning to Guam after Operation Barney were welcomed as heroes. But in secret reports, U.S. commanders made no boasts. They wrote only a simple line. Technology functioned flawlessly. There are no safe zones left for enemy vessels. Japan hadn't just lost a fleet. They had lost their faith in the sea. From 1941 to 1945, 130 Japanese submarines were sunk. Over 10,000 sailors never returned. The casualty rate was over 70%, the highest of any imperial navy force. What was once pride had become a symbol of despair. At the time, Japanese families had a saying, "If your son is assigned to a submarine, say goodbye as if to a soul." When the war ended, the Japanese realized their defeat wasn't just in the ocean. It was in how they viewed war. While they tried to build sea monsters, the Americans built a scientific ecosystem, where every device, every piece of data, every person was part of a synchronized rhythm. A nation that knew how to turn knowledge into power, and that power had drowned the entire empire of the rising sun. On September 2nd, 1945, during the surrender ceremony aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, the giant submarines I-400 and I-401 lay anchored nearby. American flags flew from their decks, once symbols of Japanese power. In the distance, through the morning mist, Japanese sailors stood silently, heads bowed, staring down at the water, the same water that had reflected the sonar buoys that once hunted them relentlessly. The ocean, once the vessel of their imperial dreams, had become a mirror of judgment. The Japanese sea lay calm, as if no war had ever happened. But for the survivors, The sonar sounds echoed forever in memory, steady pings, like knocking from another world. They knew that from that day forward, the sea had closed to them forever. And in the final silence of war, the Japanese had to admit, the ocean no longer belonged to them. It belonged to those who could listen. They called it the arsenal of democracy. While other nations fought with guns and bullets, America fought with intellect, machinery, and an industrial speed the world had never seen. In 1942, as the war escalated, President Franklin D. Roosevelt ordered the full mobilization of the U.S. economy for war. No factory stood idle, no engineer sat still. Auto plants in Detroit were transformed into aircraft engine factories. Shipyards in California ran 24 hours a day, 3 shifts, 7 days a week. In just 4 years, America built over 300 submarines, 70,000 warships of all kinds, and millions of tons of strategic supplies. It wasn't just mechanical power, it was the power of a system. While Japan praised the samurai spirit, America celebrated the assembly line. They understood that modern warfare wouldn't be won by individual glory, but by the seamless coordination of people and technology. In every shipyard, workers had only minutes between shifts. In labs, young engineers calculated every radar, sonar, and fire control computer parameter. Every bolt, every weld, every measurement was logged, verified, and pushed straight into production. The whole nation ran like a flawless machine. They didn't just produce weapons, they produced belief. An unwavering belief that science and industry were stronger than any cannon or warship. At General Electric, workers stood beneath the slogan, "Every wire counts." At Bell Laboratories, scientists tested new sonar prototypes that could detect submarines from twice the usual distance. Meanwhile, engineers at Western Electric developed FM radio systems that made sonar signals more stable and accurate. This alliance between industry and science created a strength no enemy could match. It was no coincidence that Jesse D. Taylor, the pilot who sank the I-52, was just a small link in the vast chain of the U.S. Navy. He didn't win alone. Behind him stood tens of thousands of people, thousands of factories, and millions of calculations. Every victory at sea was the result of millions of labor hours in the shadows of factories that never slept. This was America's wartime strength, the power of organization. In its 1945 strategic reports, the U.S. Navy wrote a single sentence. "The system works," just 3 words, but a declaration for an entire era, a system that learned, corrected, and improved day by day. When the Mark 14 torpedo failed in the early war years, it was the sailors themselves who tested, documented, and proposed changes. Within 2 years, a once unreliable weapon became one of the most accurate torpedoes in the Pacific. Japan couldn't replicate this. While Americans embraced trial and error, Japan hid its failures and clung to perfection, resulting in stagnation. In war, those who dare to fail go the furthest. Cold numbers proved it. An American sub could complete a mission, refuel, undergo maintenance, replace parts, and return to combat in weeks. A damaged Japanese sub waited months for repairs due to shortages of materials, parts, and skilled labor. In America, parts were manufactured across 32 states and delivered with precision to every vessel. No delays. Everything flowed like a massive river of steel. In Japan, every sub was a handcrafted project, expensive, slow to build, and hard to repair. The Japanese built beautiful submarines. The Americans built winning submarines. At the strategic level, it was the difference between aesthetics and efficiency. America didn't need ships to show off. They needed ships that worked. As the war neared its end, the U.S. held not only technical superiority, but also psychological dominance. They knew they controlled the game. Young anti-submarine pilots aboard the USS Bogue, USS Card, and USS Guadalcanal believed they were never alone. Every time they dropped a torpedo, they believed in the thousands behind them: engineers, welders, mathematicians, sonar techs, all fighting alongside them. That belief created a weapon no one could measure: the spirit of industry. After the war, many historians would call America's victory the engineers' triumph. Not because the ships were bigger or the bombs stronger, but because Americans knew how to organize knowledge. They didn't just invent, they operated. That's what made America the symbol of a new age. The ocean, once the realm of nature and instinct, had become a stage for machines and intellect. From sonar and radar to homing torpedoes, every wartime invention became the foundation of the post-war world. Science didn't just end the war, it opened a new era. When young engineers from Bell Labs, MIT, and General Electric returned home, they carried with them the battlefield's experience. From that, America's electronics, aviation, and computing industries were born. The war machine stopped, but the knowledge machine kept running. And that was the real victory. Because in the end, what defeated Japan wasn't just weaponry, it was mindset. A mindset that never stopped learning, experimenting, and believing that every problem had a scientific solution. When the final gunfire ceased, America emerged not only with victory, but with a permanent reminder. Their strength didn't lie in courage, it lay in turning knowledge into action. And from that day on, the world understood. The era of individual glory was over. The era of organization, of industry, and of science had begun. When the final gunfire fell silent, Japan was a heap of ashes. The entire country was left in ruins, in poverty, and filled with souls uncertain of what the future held. But among the survivors who returned from the sea, some carried something else: memory. The memory of an ocean that had betrayed them, and a painful lesson none of them would ever forget. At former naval bases like Kure, Sasebo, and Yokosuka, submarine officers who had lived through the war quietly began recording their experiences. They didn't write to recount their glory, but to seek an answer. Why did they lose? Hundreds of pages of reports began to emerge, meticulously detailing every battle, every lost communication, every sunken sub they couldn't explain. The more they read, the more they realized. The enemy wasn't braver than them. It was smarter in how it used intelligence. They didn't lose due to lack of skill, but because they didn't know how to turn science into strategy. One former submarine captain wrote, "We had the most beautiful ships, but the Americans had the most perfect systems." From those pages of reports, a new generation of Japanese engineers began to take shape after the war. They carried no swords, no guns, just notebooks, pencils, and a haunting question. How can we ensure our country never loses to technology again? In the 1950s, as Japan began its reconstruction, many former naval officers were invited to teach at technical universities. They spoke about radar, sonar, and the devices they had once faced. They didn't hide the pain, but they turned it into a lesson. Generations of engineering students listened as they spoke of long nights at sea, of sonar sounds they couldn't understand, of the fear in realizing the enemy knew their position before they themselves did. And they understood. To survive, you must learn. To exist, you must be better. At the same time, the Japanese government launched an industrial reconstruction plan based on a completely new model, not relying on manpower, but on science, quality, and efficiency. Former naval personnel were absorbed into industrial giants like Mitsubishi, Hitachi, Toshiba, and Sony. They brought with them military discipline, and an obsession with technology. From the wreckage of war, they began rebuilding the nation. Lessons from the deep sea became guiding principles for the entire industry. Build less, but build right. Avoid showmanship. Don't stop at ideas. Create functioning systems. The Japanese no longer aimed to build the world's largest ships, like the I-400. They built the safest, quietest, and most precise vessels. They no longer made machines to intimidate others, but to challenge themselves. From defeat in the ocean, they forged a new philosophy. Kaizen, continuous improvement. Nothing is perfect, only better than yesterday. That mindset infused every field, from factories and workshops to classrooms. They didn't forget that it was complacency that destroyed them in war. And so the post-war generation learned never to be satisfied with success. By the 1960s, as the world marveled at Japan's miraculous recovery, few knew that the foundation of that economic miracle came from the very lessons in technology and organization the Americans had forced them to learn, through blood. Thousands of Japanese engineers went to study in the U.S. They visited shipyards, sonar research centers, radar labs, electronics institutes, and brought back not just knowledge, but ways of thinking. When Japan formed its maritime self-defense force, it partnered directly with the U.S. Navy. Japanese sailors trained aboard American ships, learning how to operate sonar and radar, how to share information, how to organize a combat system. The same officers who had once fought the war now stood in front of classrooms, teaching in hushed voices. Once, we were hunted by what we could not see. Now we must understand it, before others use it against us. And they succeeded. By the 1980s, Japanese submarines were considered the quietest and most sophisticated in the world, second only to the United States. They had completed a full circle in history, from being hunted to mastering the art of the hunt. No longer the arrogance of an empire, but the quiet confidence of a people who had learned the deepest lesson. That technology is not just power, but principle, a reflection of how humans use intellect to avoid repeating past tragedies. When young Japanese engineers looked back at their forebears, they didn't see failure. They saw a warning. Never underestimate science. Never believe courage alone can replace understanding. And when modern submarines like the Soryu and Taige classes emerged, powered by lithium-ion batteries, operating almost silently, people said they were a belated apology from the souls lost in the submarines of the past, those who now rested at the bottom of the sea because they couldn't hear the sound of the future approaching. Today, the ocean is no longer a battlefield between Japan and America. It's a bridge, linking two former enemies now working together in the same sonar rhythm, the same data stream, the same belief that knowledge defines power. From the ashes of war, the Japanese rebuilt a nation using the very lessons they had learned from defeat. That the ocean never belongs to the stronger. It belongs to the one who understands it more deeply. In 1995, half a century after the war ended, a team of American divers discovered the wreck of the I-52 submarine, lying over 5,000 meters deep in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The hull remained intact, its steel shell covered in green moss, but inside there was absolute silence. In that darkness, 96 souls still rested in their places, men who had left Japan believing they were on a mission for the empire, unaware they would become witnesses to a new era of humanity. When an exploration robot cast the first light into the submarine's chamber, shards of metal reflected like tiny stars. No one said a word. The ocean had kept its secret for 50 years. But now, that secret no longer belonged to the dead. It had become a reminder for the living. Inside the compartment, experts found thin wire reels, Gordon wire number 1, and number 2, holding the audio recorded on the night the submarine was sunk. When the tape was played back, the room filled only with the sound of waves and breaking steel, faint but unmistakable. A long silence followed. Then a historian softly said, "This is the sound of the 20th century closing itself." Because in each explosion was the birth of a new age, an age where knowledge surpassed force and technology dictated the fate of nations. America had won, but it also understood that such victory came with a responsibility. If science could create power to destroy, then it must also protect humanity from itself. For the Japanese, listening to that recording was not hearing defeat. It was hearing a lesson. A former naval officer said, "We died because we didn't understand those sounds. Now our grandchildren live because they do." And he smiled, a sad but peaceful smile. After the war, the two nations that had once fought and killed beneath the sea now sat at the same table, researching sonar together, sharing oceanic data, and teaching each other how to protect the marine environment. At international naval conferences, American and Japanese officers stood together before global sonar maps, not maps of war, but maps of knowledge. The ocean, once a border soaked in blood, had become a bridge between two civilizations. Sonar buoys that once hunted submarines were now used to track currents, save lives, and study climate. Submarines that once carried torpedoes now carried scientists. Children learning sonar today do so not to fight, but to understand the language of the sea. The world has moved far beyond 1944, but the legacy of that night still lingers, like a ripple echoing through time. It reminds humanity, technology has no morality. Morality lies in the hands of those who wield it, just as the ocean belongs to no one, but to those who listen. As the 21st century begins, sonar, radar, computers, and artificial intelligence all are descendants of wartime invention. And the lesson from the I-52, from the ships that sank into the deep, remains unchanged. If people fail to understand one another, they will repeat the same mistakes, only with more sophisticated tools. But perhaps, in the silence of the deep sea, something else endures. A quiet yet enduring belief that humanity can learn. From war to cooperation, from destruction to innovation, from failure to humility, and from silence to listening. As Japanese and American research vessels glide across the Atlantic above the resting place of the I-52, modern sonar sends out clear pings, echoing steadily from the seabed. A Japanese engineer sits beside an American one. Both are silent. The waves echo through their headsets, like the heartbeat of Earth. One of them whispers, "Listen, maybe the sea is still telling the old story." And the other replies, "Yes, the story of those who learned to turn hatred into knowledge." The ocean now belongs to no one. It belongs to all, to those who dare to understand, to learn, and to change. From the darkness of the I-52, humanity saw light, not from gold, but from wisdom. Because in the end, true victory is not about who survives, but about who learns the most from death.